So welcome to this Institute of Modern Languages research seminar. And today we have got Zach Eastock talking on Rabelais' radical farce, Reconsidered. What did Dindenault do to deserve this? I'll introduce Zach shortly, just to begin with a couple of practicalities. So after his presentation, which will be around 20 to 25 minutes, there'll be time for discussion and questions. So you can post questions in the chat. We'd also like you to kind of maybe interact. So if in the discussion part, do feel free to, raise your hand or let me know if you'd like to ask a question, and kind of there will be time to kind of unmute yourself and respond to Zach's presentation with questions or comments. So I think that is everything. As I say, do, if you can, make sure you're muted during Zach's presentation. That would be very much appreciated. And I will move on now to introduce Zach. So Zach is currently writing his MRes thesis with us here at the IMLR on the works of François, Rabelais and their long 19th century musico-theatrical adaptations. And this builds on Zach's longer term interest in music and theatrical adaptations, and he's previously published in the journal German Life and Letters on Verdi's adaptation of Schiller's Don Carlos. I think I'm doing lots of weird pronunciations, combining French and German and all sorts here. So I'm also really delighted to confirm that Zach is going to be starting an AHRC-funded PhD in Durham in French studies in the autumn, which will build on his current project. But I will hand over to Zach now to start sharing his screen and to begin his presentation, which will be on Rabelais' radical farce, Reconsidered. What did Dindenault do to deserve this? Thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to share my screen really quick. 1 second. Oh gosh, technology, eh? How's that? Is that working?
Great.
Great, cool. Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for coming. I suppose the best thing about this master's is the safe space it's given me to play with ideas. I'm not yet a doctor, nor actually yet a doctoral candidate. That's happening next year. And so the pressure's off a little. While I'm writing this thesis, I've had to make my figurative bed. In fact, to be honest, I've made a pretty large one here, I think. I don't actually have to lie in it just yet. In this space, I've been able to take several key themes and concepts in Rabelais studies, give them a good old prod, and boldly say what I think I can see, free from the threat of peer reviews, Viva panels, or actually any sort of research output quota whatsoever, except, of course, my word count. This is, for now, what I think I can see. Maybe in a few years, I'll see something else. Maybe I'll find more evidence and double down, who knows? But for now, I think it's worth throwing at a wall like a nearly ready piece of spaghetti and seeing if it sticks. And yeah, I'm very grateful to the IMLR for giving me such a fabulous wall to throw it at. So I'm aware that some people on the call won't be Rabelais scholars or even have read much Rabelais, so I'm going to start with story time. In chapters 5 to 8 of the Quart Livre, this is Rabelais' 4th book, Pantagruel and his entourage meet a group of traveling merchants who are sailing back home to Saintonge in northwestern France from Lanternland. Panurge gets into an argument with a shepherd called Dindenault, who calls him, still unmarried at this point, a cuckold. The conflict escalates until everyone draws their blades. Luckily, the helmsman intervenes, diffuses the situation, and the pair shake hands in perfect reconciliation. Panurge then turns to Epistemon and Frère Jean, who are 2 other members of Pantagruel's entourage, secretly telling them to stand back and enjoy the beau jeu, or good bit of theatre. He then approaches Dindenault and asks to buy one of his sheep. Dindenault refuses. Panurge asks over and over again, but is refused every time. First, because he does not look like a shepherd, then because the sheep are too valuable. Dindenault ridicules Panurge, calling him Robin Mouton and making sheep noises. Panurge replies calmly, reminding himself to be patient while repeatedly asking to buy a sheep. Eventually, after another intervention by the helmsman, Dindenault capitulates and sells Panurge a sheep for 3 livres tournois, about 6 times the normal price. After selecting and paying for the most resplendent of Dindenault's flock, Panurge tosses it into the sea. Hearing its desperate drowning bleats, the other sheep begin hurling themselves overboard too, and panicking, Dindenault grabs hold of a ram. But alas, the animal is just too strong and drags the shepherd over into the water with him. Panurge then picks up an oar, and while holding Dindenault underwater with it, recites rhetorical commonplaces. So, generally speaking, approaches to this episode fall into one of two camps, the economic and the theatrical. On the economic side of things, Terence Cave has argued that through Panurge, Rabelais is able to explore early modern economic behaviors and practices. Early modern economic behaviors and practices, as well as notions of value and currency. Philippe Dessin continues this in his exploration of the early modern economic imaginary. This is a sort of shared economic consciousness which permeates the writing of Rabelais and his contemporaries. For Dessin, the scene parodies and subverts the sorts of mercantile exchange which had taken hold of the Lyonnais marketplace over Rabelais' lifetime. More recently, last year I think, Catherine Ibbott had argued that the sheep, the pastoral image par excellence, appears in the scene as a symbol of agricultural and thus economic expansion into the New World, reflecting the era's increasingly globalized networks of trade. The scene is quite overtly economic. It's very hard to argue otherwise. Not only does Dindenault literally call his sheep money, he calls them moutons à la grande laine, which was at the time Rabelais was writing, it was also the name of a coin. But he and Panurge are engaged in commerce, albeit of a very strange variety. Panurge is trying to buy a sheep, and Dindenault does eventually sell him one, though for a hugely inflated price. The other approach is that of the thespians, who argue the scene is a piece of theatre, one structurally and thematically similar to late medieval farce. Christian de Loin-Slouet has demonstrated how Panurge constructs a theatrical space of impunity in which he can exact revenge on the shepherd for insulting him in a production at once comic and tragic. Bernadette Reyflaud has drawn clear parallels between the Dindenault scene and the Farce de Maître Pierre Patelin, whose intrigue, at least in its second half, also revolves around a naughty shepherd, this time called Thibaut Langlet, who also makes silly sheep noises. Like the economic arguments, the theatricality of the scene is really hard to deny. It takes place on the deck of a ship, a raised platform which, like the world of the theatrical stage, is enclosed and insular, not surrounded by seats, but surrounded by open water. Panurge describes his revenge as a beau jeu, a nice piece of theatre for which there is an audience. At one point, the dialogue even breaks down into a script format. The association with farce in particular is also quite hard to deny. There are numerous references in the scene to well-known farces, not just Patelin, but also a farce called Robin Mouton, which is the name that Dindenault gives Panurge. It's also the name of a main character from a farce called Robin Mouton. While this farcical theme has been explored by several critics, it is Bruce Hayes who takes this critical approach the furthest, arguing that throughout all of Rabelais' texts, farce, quote, serves as both a structuring mechanism and a rhetorical weapon for social, religious, and political satire, end quote. Hayes argues that farce is essentially a conservative genre, which Rabelais co-opts and repurposes, rendering it a tool for satirically undermining hegemonic power structures. For Hayes, Rabelais takes a genre, quote, characterized by its fundamental conservatism that seeks to maintain the status quo, end quote, and radically alters it, vastly expanding its subversive potential. In short, for Hayes, Rabelais' texts and the Dindenault scene make conservative farce no longer conservative. It is, quote, radically transformed, end quote. Now, I agree with Hayes. Rabelais' farce is radically transformed. That much is true. But I claim this transformation does not liberate the genre from its overarching conservative ethos, imbuing it with a subversiveness it would have otherwise lacked. No, instead, as I will demonstrate using the Dindenault episodes as my example, this transformation operates in more or less the exact opposite direction to the one outlined by Hayes. In Rabelais' hands, what was a deeply subversive genre paradigm is instead rendered radically conservative. But hey, we're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we, a little? What do I actually mean when I talk about a farce or a farce-like structure? I should probably clarify that. Well, structurally, farces are pretty straightforward. You have a common character, a baker, a cobbler, a farmhand, a shepherd, who transgresses a societal norm of some kind, overstepping some social or behavioral boundary. This transgression is known as démesure, or excess. Characters guilty of démesure are, according to the norms of farce, then punished in what is known as the volte-face. This is a humiliating reversal towards the end of the play, in which the character who has overstepped social bounds is brought crashing back down, most often in a violent or humiliating way, and also quite often one achieved by cunning trickery. Now, when taken at face value, this does seem pretty conservative. Someone of a low socio-economic status is first allowed to transgress and then violently put in their rightful place in the social order. We must remember, however, that farce is a theatrical genre. Theatrical genres are performed. And performances have audiences who, regardless of their socio-economic or socio-cultural identity, always possess at least some level of interpretive power. It is this which ultimately decides the genre's ethos. In his recent study, Pure Filth, Noah D. Gunn argues that the treatment of the farcical genre paradigm in critical discourse since the 17th century has privileged the voices of the humanist intelligentsia, denying, quote, to the supposedly benighted hoi polloi the capacity to imagine alternative social realities or oppose existing ones, end quote. While the farce audience was drawn from all social ranks and milieus, actually only those near the top of the socio-economic hierarchy would have the means to record, print, and promulgate these plays, effectively constituting a layer of censorship by the ruling and intellectual classes. Further, when tracing the influence of farce on other forms of cultural artifact, like Rabelais' texts, for example, one is unavoidably influenced by discourses of wealth and power. Writing presupposes literacy, which in this period generally presupposed some level of wealth. And then what survives does so because of its acceptance by those who control both the means of intellectual reproduction and what goes into archives, the humanist intelligentsia to which Rabelais certainly belonged. Theatrical texts, like those of farce, are also written foreseeing an eventual performance. They contain a potential to be performed, a space to be filled at the point of performance. As Valère Novarina puts it, the script, quote, est toujours un texte à venir. It's always a text to come. By claiming that, quote, dans le texte, le manque est inscrit, in the text, a lack is inscribed, and that, quote, le texte de théâtre s'écrit avec beaucoup de vide autour. The text is written with lots of emptiness around it. Novarina emphasizes the unfinishedness of a theatrical text, the room left for performance. Conversely, therefore, the restriction of a performance genre to text constitutes its hollowing out. Layers of symbolic meaning contained in the non-verbal aspects of the performance are removed, leaving little to no room for the subversive nuance which Gunn has identified in late medieval farce. Indeed, Gunn claims that one must, quote, resituate farce within its original communicative settings, end quote, in order to access the deeper level of symbolic meaning contained in this vide around the script, the emptiness, the void to fill our performance. In these settings, Gunn identifies a, quote, subaltern resistance that can never be fully eradicated and retains its power precisely because it can be so difficult to detect, end quote. However, this is neither the impression of the genre which Rabelais' text gives, nor one which many in the French Renaissance economic or intellectual establishment would have actually sought to convey. It's unclear whether they would even be privy to this aspect of the performance, as the subaltern resistance was often hidden behind what Jelle Koopmans has called the rire grinçant, the cynical laugh of the common crowd. None of this changes the structure of farce itself. Someone is still guilty of démesure, and this does still inexorably lead to a volte-face, but it does change the genre's impact. By trapping farce in text and keeping it away from the largely illiterate common audience whose presence and perception traditionally constituted the locus of the genre's subversive power, farce in Rabelais is thus radically disarmed, no longer a vehicle for socio-culturally subversive content, but instead a paradigm in which those at the bottom of the socio-economic hierarchy must accept their position unquestioningly, with violent and degrading punishments if they do not. By removing the common audience from the equation, Rabelais leaves no room for even a raised eyebrow, let alone a cynical chuckle from the lower classes. Any subversive space is removed. So, turning back to the Dindenault episode then, as we seem to have strayed a little, the volte-face moment here is pretty obvious. The shepherd and his flock are drowned. But why? What did Dindenault do to deserve this? Now, answering this question will require us, like a bunch of Rabelaisian Ghostbusters, to cross the streams. We must integrate the economic and the theatrical approaches to the scene. So, while Rabelais was writing and living and working in Lyon, an elitist consumer culture, which originated in northern Italian markets of the mid-1400s, was spreading into and taking hold of the Lyonnese marketplace. By the middle of the 16th century, Italian merchants had established what amounted to a mercantile colony in Lyon, and their influence triggered an unprecedented expansion in the city's luxury local goods trade, transforming it from just a mere stop on a trans-European trade route to an important center of commerce in its own right. At this time, only those near the top of the socio-economic hierarchy really truly traded luxuries often, more than once every few years. And even then that was, you had to have some wealth. Well, yes, technically, the Renaissance purchasing power ladder did extend from the bottom to the top of the socioeconomic hierarchy, theoretically creating the potential for some form of trickle-down wealth. In practice, because of what Laura Martinez has called, quote, the structures of public finance that petted the wealthy and burdened the humble, end quote, it was nearly impossible for someone not already part of elite educated culture to enter it. Wealth accumulation was, and let's face it, still is, exclusionary, accompanied in the Renaissance, as Martinez explains, by, quote, soaring prices, stagnant wages, and recurrent famine, owing to which 65 to 80% of people worried chronically about the annual grain crop and the price of bread next winter, end quote. Dindenault is not part of the metropolitan elite, not even nearly. He's a lowly shepherd from rural northwestern France, likely part of that 65 to 80% who worried about bread prices. And yet, the price he quotes Panurge is astronomically high, 6 times higher than would be expected for a wool pelt from his region on the Lyonnese market at the time Rabelais was writing. Well, yes, by the middle of the 16th century, wool had risen in value in France, French wool, and yes, the most expensive pelts in the country were those from Noireau in the Santon region from which Dindenault hails. Their average value was 6 to 10 times less than the equal weight in silk, which was the real luxury textile over the same period. In this context, Dindenault's inflated price begins to look like an attempt to sell his pelts as though they were luxurious Italian silk. And his ruse is emphasized by his comparison of his sheep to moutons de Levant, as most Levantine silk imports, actually textile imports more broadly, came into Lyon via Italy. Still, hey, the value of these sheep is, according to Dindenault, derived from more than their wool. The shepherd breaks his sheep down into all their potentially profitable uses. Leather as good as Morocco, violin and as that of Morocco, violin and harp strings more melodious than those even of Munich or Aquila, meat fit for kings, fertile urine, also suitable for alchemy and for use in medicine, and horns, which when ground, sown and watered, produce asparagus. Dindenault's polyvalent herd transcends the normal bounds of sheepishness, and the wonders of which they are capable come, according to him, from their mythological genealogy. He claims they are of the same stock from which Jason took the golden fleece. Their genealogy and their panoply of superlative and supernatural uses render these sheep both genetically and practically durable. In Dindenault's eyes and in his pricing, they become durable goods of enormous quality and luxury. Their high value is contained in their genealogy, their provenance, to borrow the term from rare art dealers. Dindenault, the peasant shepherd, thus seems to be trying to infiltrate the luxury goods market of 16th century France's wealthy elite, a market from which he would have been absolutely economically excluded. Dindenault's murder is thus a visceral representation and reinforcing of the economic structures of the period. The shepherd is being punished for trying to take part in a trade reserved for the rich. The extreme, often deadly poverty in which the vast majority lived during the early 16th century becomes the sea under which Dindenault is held. Panurge and the ore he uses to ensure Dindenault's demise embody the early modern economic systems which kept the wealthy rich and the poor in poverty. The rightful place to which the shepherd is returned is literally a struggle for survival at the hands of a representative of a higher social order, signaled by the cultivated rhetorical oration delivered by Panurge as he holds Dindenault underwater with his oar. Rabelais seems to be pushing a very elitist and conservative agenda here. His corruption of farce, particularly its dislocation from its original communicative settings, creates a space of impunity for Panurge in which he can silence Dindenault, the social climber, forever, embodying and acting out a symbolic representation of early modern economic oppression from the enclosed world of a theatrical stage at sea and away from the raised eyebrows or rire croissant of a common crowd. So in summary, the Dindenault episode stands at the intersection of two discourses, the economic and the farcical. By removing the farce paradigm from its original communicative settings, Rabelais, and more broadly, those who controlled what was printed and archived, has left no space for the subversive potential of farce, which requires performance before a common audience in order to be actualized. As a result, both Rabelais' dislocated farce paradigm and Renaissance elitist consumer culture carry with them broadly the same socioeconomic message, one of the enduring dominance of those with money, power, and education. The way Rabelais uses farce to restate and reinforce socioeconomic and sociocultural hierarchies is surprisingly conservative for someone who is, in the eyes of so many, such a radically innovative writer. And it certainly undermines Hayes's claim that Rabelais and his elite humanist compatriots were the ones who ultimately, quote, recognized farce's potential to be transformed into a political weapon to be used against entrenched institutions, end quote. It kind of already was. It's certainly hard to reconcile this hegemony upholding Rabelais with the world upending one seen by Mikhail Bakhtin, for example. Perhaps this inconsistency will never be reconciled. Perhaps it was intentional, Rabelais' last great literary joke. Or perhaps the real innovation here was a radical conservatism its innovative literary forms, too divergent from the mainstream conservative discourses of Rabelais' time to be fully accepted. Ultimately, his conservative use and indeed abuse of farce has persisted precisely because, by coming packaged in the hollowed out shell of a commoner's genre, it has remained so difficult to detect. Thank you very much. I think we should transition gracefully and seamlessly into discussion, Q&A. Where have you all gone? There you are. Hello, everyone. You're back.
Brilliant. Thanks, Zach. Yeah, that was a really stimulating and compelling presentation, which I think everyone here, you can see the hand claps and reactions. I should just mention quickly, I forgot to mention at the start, we are recording the seminar. So do let us know though if you contribute to the discussion but don't want to be in the recording. So if you let us know in the chat if you don't want to be in the recording, that would be very much appreciated. But what I will do, I'll maybe use my kind of chair privilege first to ask questions, and in the meantime do feel free for anyone else to ask or pose questions. You can either raise your virtual hand, or if you've got your video I should be able to see you, or post in the chat. But yeah, I just want to begin. We may have more specific questions about the text, which I'm not that familiar with. I wondered, but an idea that I thought was interesting in your presentation that I just want to ask you initially about is, I think one thing your presentation points to is the way the complexity of the past and the multiplicity and heterogeneity of voices is erased as elite voices come to kind of construct quite a singular narrative that becomes kind of hegemonic. I was just wondering, as a researcher, what is the method? You know, I think this happens, as you say, because of the archive, what's there, what kind of remains, whose voices remain. What do you see as the kind of the methodological challenges, and how do you approach trying to bring back that kind of complexity and heterogeneity of the past?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that you take away from reading Noah D. Gunn's book is that actually quite a lot of it is in archives. They're just not in the BNF, and they're not in the Archives Nationales de France. They're in, for him, he uses a lot of stuff that he's dug out of an archive in Arras, for example. These kind of rural areas where very few researchers actually dare to tread. So I think actually some of it is just people haven't dug deep enough to find those voices, or, you know, as Laura Martinez elsewhere in his paper puts it, you know, elite culture is infinitely alluring. In some ways, it's much more exciting to talk about people who have loads of money, you know, because they did loads of stuff which had effects. And so I suppose that's one way of kind of plugging that gap, is actually digging in a different direction in smaller archives. I suppose in terms of Rabelais scholarship more specifically, actually, I think Rabelais, not wanting to kind of necessarily totally rehabilitate Bakhtin, because I think, you know, he's on the naughty step for very good reasons. He was right in saying that there was a lot of influence from common genres and commoners in his work, which Rabelais really did deal with. He just didn't necessarily deal with it in the way that Bakhtin thought. For example, if you take the scene from Pantagruel, I think it's Pantagruel 15, though I might be wrong, at the procession of Corpus Christi, there is a crowd there. You know, there's an implied crowd. Implied by its setting. You know, actually Rabelais' works, with the exception of the stuff that happens among elites on his ship in the fourth book, actually a lot of it happens in marketplaces, in town squares, in Paris. And so I think a lot of it is, and it kind of to nicely tie up my answer to your question, I think people need to dig further in archives in different directions to the ones they have up till now, and also acknowledge that writers put these people in their texts and you just need to look for them. I think it's another kind of parallel example with women in Rabelais' texts, for example. I think Olivia Tolley in her PhD thesis referred to women as having a spectral presence, and I think kind of common market goers and the kind of everyman in the Renaissance also has a kind of spectral presence in Rabelais' texts, which interestingly is somewhat brought out in the adaptations in the 19th century, which I think is interesting because they have to go from being implied to being actually explicitly seen on stage. Yeah. Great.
Really interesting, and better than the normal response of going, it's really hard. But actually, I think the Royal Archives point is really
it is really hard because it's, like when you go into an archive, normally you have a kind of idea of where stuff might be because people have referenced it in the past. And actually, and they're scary places. Let's not beat around the bush. Archives are terrifying. They're like these kind of horrible labyrinths full of stuff, and so yeah, I think it is difficult. That's why people don't do it that often. I think people need to, certainly.
Are there any other questions? I think, Catherine Banks, if you want to, you should be able to unmute yourself, I think.
Yeah. Thanks ever so much, Zach. That was really fascinating. And I very much take your point about farce not being as conservative as Bruce Hayes depicted it in his book, and the complexity of the economic argument here. You do tend to suggest that this is quite monologic when you talk about Rabelais being conservative here. And I wonder what you think about the internal audience. So so Frère Jean criticizes Panurge here, and part of, so clearly the economic aspect is there. At the same time, isn't Dindenault being punished also for all the things he said to Panurge, which are the same things that all the other characters have been saying to Panurge? You're a cuckold and so on. Yeah. So it's a question about the internal audience and whether that means that this can be less. Have more, like the theatre, have more of a possibility for multiple readings.
Yeah, I mean, I think I probably need to give it a bit more thought. It's a good point that you raise about this audience, which I have kind of dwelt on a little bit. I think if anything, it's quite telling that the person on the ship who's watching this whole thing, and actually, as you say, Dindenault is just saying what other people have said to Panurge at other points, but it's him who gets drowned and not Frère Jean. I think in some ways that might potentially tie into this idea of lower socioeconomic strata are the ones who kind of have to get the torrent of mud in the face, if that makes sense. But I definitely have to give it more thought, I think, these internal crowds. Yeah.
I think we've got, I'll go to, I think Marianne's got her hand raised, and in the meantime, Johann's put a question in the chat, which I'll maybe read out afterwards, or maybe Johann can read aloud, but I'll begin with Marianne if you want to.
Well, first of all, thank you, Zach. That was great, a real treat. And one of the things I really enjoyed there was seeing that traditional divide of the late medieval and the early modern being broken down here. As a medievalist, when I first came to Rabelais, I was struck by how medieval in some ways, or how much he exploits the late medieval literary context.
Absolutely.
And there is clear evidence of him knowing a whole range of late medieval, as you say, popular genre.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate a little bit for us on maybe the particularity of Patelin here, because Patelin is not a typical farce, really.
Yeah, Patelin is a weird one. It's kind of, everyone talks about these farcical structures and then says, well, Patelin's the one that's allowed to break it all because it's so special. Normally you have this, so you have this structure of démesure and volte-face, and one way you can kind of conceptualize Patelin is as doing it almost twice. It's got two volte-face moments in the first half and the second half. I mean, I'd be the first to say, while I do talk about farce, I'm not necessarily an expert in it or a medievalist particularly. I'm very sorry for that, Marianne. I know you tried. But yeah, I think Yeah, Pathelin is a really odd one. I think the reason why Rabelais likes it so much is because there's such a clear level of vengeance involved, and this idea, and also this easy sheep reference. Though actually, I think, and I haven't mentioned it in the talk, I think one of the reasons why Rabelais may have turned to it is because of the intersection with Teofilo Folengo, who also has a load of vengeful shepherd drowning on a ship. Is the Macronic poet from Italy. His character, it's not Baldus, it's the other one. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. If anyone knows, you can please feel free to jump in. His friend, who's the kind of the equivalent of Panurge in Folengo, also drowns a group of shepherds for overcharging him for sheep. And so I think there's this kind of really quite what's the word? Useful and easily accessible reference, kind of ready-made intertextual reference between Folengo and Pathelin. Again, I'm hoping to really dig more into Farce as my studies go forward. But yes, I think the kind of question of why Pathelin is useful. There's also some suggestion that Rabelais actually performed it, I think. He performed farces while he was a student in Montpellier. There was one, the farce of the mute woman, I think, is one that he talks about a lot talks about once in earlier on in the fourth book, I think. No, later on in the fourth book, in the Bachet scene. And so, yeah, I think it's a particular case which does need more unpacking. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I guess also it would be an intertextual reference that many people would pick up. And Pathelin, there's a lot of economic. He gets at the draper for overcharging the cloth as well.
It's a kind of real confluence of the economic and the farcical, and also the vengeful for poor people, because the Teofilo Folengo text is much more pointedly anti-poor. He talks about how you can never trust a shepherd because the shepherds will always run off with your money, and they all better be drowned, and they're best left in the fields, whatever, So he's much more kind of outspokenly, obviously anti-poor. So it's a kind of, I think, a kind of ready-made intertextual nebula nexus kind of thing. Yeah.
Great.
Johan had a question in the.
Johan, do you want to unmute yourself, or maybe is that?
Yeah. Thanks, Zach. I thought that was brilliant. I really enjoyed that very, very much. It was interesting for me because cattle comes from capital, and capital comes from caput, counting heads. So I think the reference to sheep there is very apposite. I really enjoyed it. And I really like this point about the farcical being, although you qualified it, being a essentially conservative trope. It also reminds me of English humor, which I think has as its main function to ensure that nothing ever changes in society. I think it's a similar point. I was thinking, so is there a way to see the relation between the reader and the text as an enactment of this farcical, in the sense of a commoner attending a farcical theater piece, in that the economic as such, the relation between rich and poor, or the fact that there is money at all, that becomes, that is farcically deployed, and the reader becomes the person who, from an existential point of view, can see all of that as vanity or as not essential, or it's not really about what life is about, and in that sense affect a kind of a catharsis. And so that might, I wonder if that would add another layer to this.
Yeah,
I don't want to take anything away from Rabelais' conservatism, because I think you're right there, but that might be, I don't know. That was just my thought.
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly make an argument that Rabelais is essentially holding a mirror and going, look what the intellectual establishment are doing. They're banishing the poor from their own genre. I think I would have to spend quite a lot more time, and to be honest, more time than this master's is necessarily going to allow me, really unpacking that. But yeah, I take your point. I mean, I think one of the difficulties with talking about this scene in general is that it's not just mise on a beam, it's mise on a beam, 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 you know, and it's kind of where to situate yourself in that, is proving quite difficult, and, you know, obviously has proved quite difficult for the last 400 years, because, I mean, we're still discussing it. But yes, I think your point is a very good one, which I've noted down. Also, just on the back of your off the back of your comment here, it's interesting, isn't it? The sheep. I mean, it really is not just a pastoral image par excellence. It's also actually economic. I mean, you know, Thomas More, for example, in Utopia, talks about how what is it? People are going to, words to the effect of people are going to starve because the sheep are eating all of their food. And then eating the men themselves. Yeah, your sheep will want to eat the men themselves, I think is the quote, something like that. And it's like people in early modern England, but also to an extent towards the middle of the 16th century in France, while French wool production really ticked up. Just went sheep crazy. They just couldn't get enough of selling wool.
Yeah,
it became mad.
So I think that you could maybe say there is kind of anticipatory awareness in the text that one day those who own the means of production, rather than the feudal landlords, will be the ones who control the economy. So the shepherd may have a bigger future than the text itself is consciously aware of. You could use kind of
mirroring that. Actually, once you get to the operatic stage, the shepherd's role gets kind of increasingly large until you. I mean, the adaptation that I'm working on at the moment, which is by Théodore Labarre from 1855, Dindenault. Not only is he a character thread through the entire narrative, but he actually wins at the end. He wins the girl from Panurge and Pantagruel.
Exactly.
So that's a really interesting point, which I'm frantically noting down. So thanks.
Cool. Yeah, no, I really like it. So refreshing. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I think next we have Emmanuelle. Has got her hand raised.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Zach. It was very, very interesting, very brilliant talk. I really enjoyed that. I just had a question for you. I wondered if you had thought about a comparison between this episode and the Haute Dame de Paris for the farcical and the theatrical aspect, because it strikes me that the flock of sheep or the group of dogs, there seems to be some kind of interesting parallel from a even purely theatrical point of view in the gestures, in the theatricality of the episode.
Absolutely. Actually, in the chapter, in the thesis chapter that this comes from, I spend quite a few words actually unpicking the Haute Dame de Paris passage because the parallel is so strong. Also, because it's another example, it's the other example that I give of Rabelais reinforcing and restating the gender order and the gender and the gender binary. So essentially reinstating the socio-economic hierarchy, or the kind of socio-cultural hierarchy of France at the time. Because, I mean, you know, there are these examples there of Panurge doubting. He says, was I fooled by your physiognomy? You know, you're acting like a man. And at that time, you know, obviously gender was a sociological construct. So if you acted like a man, you became a man. If you acted like a woman, you became a woman biologically. So yeah, I think you're it's right to bring up that passage. I think your point on, or you're mentioning gesture and the kind of gestural aspect of it is something I hadn't actually thought of. So I have also noted that down and will be having a good long think about it. But yes, I think you've got a point. Although also, I would potentially parry it by saying that while the sheep are all murdered, the dogs, I mean, they're a modality of oppression. You know, I mean, only one of those is killed, you know. So yeah, but I take your point, and I will have a good old look at it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm not sure if there are any other questions. So if anyone wants to signal to me, I think Catherine Davis just said in the chat that it was an excellent presentation of interest across languages and clearly delivered.
Thanks, Catherine.
Positive feedback. Oh, I think Charles has a question.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. That was great. Just as you were talking, I was thinking, clearly you were talking about the way in which power, wealth, capital uses humor and comedy to obscure property relations and to ridicule contestation. And just playing off Johann's point, this is clearly then you're talking about what you say has clear relevance to the present, and indeed what you're implying is also what the role of the academic is in times of social commentary and using the past to commentate on mechanisms that we see in the present and indeed possibly anticipate the future. So could you say a little bit more about the implied role of the academic as social commentator that is very clearly present in your talk?
Well, so I think the first thing to outline is that when Rabelais was writing, he was writing at a real watershed moment for capitalism, not just for kind of for venture capitalism as well. So international globalized trade networks of trade, the world was really changing. And, you know, I mean, if you only have to compare, for example, Rabelais and Montaigne and the ways that they were 50 years apart, but the ways that they differ on how they deal with meditating on this kind of social upheaval. I think, the question you raise is a really good one. Is what's the role of thinkers and of academics in this at these times of change? And I think you've noticed something that I've implied, that I potentially haven't given quite enough thought to how I was implying it. I think, so I will definitely go and think more about it. But I mean, I just think it shows the power that not bad academia, but academia with, or academic practice with a kind of ulterior motive can actually totally obscure people for hundreds and hundreds of years. You know, I mean, a lot of people who write about farce après Bruce Hayes in the last kind of 11 years. And they kind of take what Bruce Hayes has said about farce as what farce is. In the same way that actually, in fact, my old supervisor, Rowan Tomlinson, the first time she warned me about Bakhtin, she said, the thing is, people who aren't Rabelais scholars take what Bakhtin says about Rabelais and think that's what Rabelais is. And I think it's the same thing happening here. If someone says something forcefully enough and has enough of a wave behind them and is enough of the canon, for example, then what they say, they can say what they want. It will be taken as true. That said, though, one thing that I am kind of toying with and which I'm hoping to properly explore in my PhD is whether that's actually something which has been lost over the 20th century, because there are some pretty divergent readings of Rabelais, a lot of them really giving power back to the commoner, or back to the commoner, over the 1800s and into the very early 1900s, especially with people like Jarry who are writing versions of Rabelais which undermine the rich, and this Labarre work essentially it was cancelled after one performance because it contained these suspicious political allusions which were, I think, anti-aristocracy, and so there's a kind of, I'm just not quite sure whether at what point did that discourse get obscured. That's, I think, the question that I'd like to ask going forward, and whether it's the responsibility of Rabelais, well, I mean, it probably is, but whether it's the responsibility of Rabelais alone and how he dealt with farce, or Rabelais and then a load of people who really wanted to kind of worship him as this forward-thinking, reform-minded liberal humanist who all of the misogyny and all of the anti-poor people stuff, that's just part of his humanist humanist agenda. Actually, I don't know who's really most at fault for obscuring these kind of lower class voices, let's say. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Great. I think, you've had a very thorough questioning, so I will just see if there's anyone else who wants to signal they ask a question, but I think we have left quite a generous time. So also, I think unless there are any final questions or comments, I'd like to take this opportunity then to thank Zach. I think, as everyone has said here, it's been a really stimulating presentation and also discussion, and I'm also sure, thanks also to the audience, I think Zach said he's been scribbling down lots of suggestions and comments.
Absolutely.
Thanks to you all for engaging and for your kind of feedback and suggestions, which I'm sure are also incredibly valuable. So yeah, thanks to everyone, and see you hopefully at future IMLR events.